Thank you for watching, thank you for being with us. And we can start right away with the announced musical riddle. It will not be easy at all today, although I think you will recognize the composer after the first few notes. But the piece itself, that is a bit tougher. Listen carefully not only to the music but also watch the whole scene, because it foreshadows the main theme of today's market. Let's get to it. So, did you recognize the composer in the piece? If so, write to us in the comments or email me or the Abby Bailo-Jasno email address. But perhaps an even more important question, did you recognize the instrument that Simon Tupczewski was playing? That was not a Steinway or a Steinbeck. That is a Steinbeck. That was our dear Czech Petrof. And as newspaper headlines have shown in recent days, our Petrof is getting into quite big trouble. That is nothing new. Over the last 20 years, we have occasionally read headlines about Petrof having to cut costs or struggling with sales, but its brilliant boss, Mrs. Zuzana Petrofova, always managed to get the company out of these problems again, and always in a very inventive way. And by making changes and expanding their business group, she brought this classic brand back. This time, however, it seems it will not be so simple. Let us listen to an excerpt from these articles, specifically from what was published on the Forbes website and on the E15 website.
160 years of Czech tradition, an instrument known to concert halls all over the world, and a brand that has survived wars, regimes, and economic crises. But now, the Hradec Králové-based Petrof is facing a problem that may not be just another crisis. Back in 2021, Petrof employed over 200 people. Today, it is about 100. The company is cutting more jobs, reducing production capacity, and trying to lower costs. The numbers show the reason. The operating loss reached 54 million crowns. The situation is all the more interesting for Petrof, as it was making a profit quite recently. In the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, it generated a total profit of over 53 million crowns. Now, the company itself admits that it no longer considers the current decline a short-term fluctuation and is therefore changing its strategy. Instead of chasing mass-market customers, it wants to focus more on concert halls, schools, institutions, and wealthier private clients, those who are not just buying a musical instrument, but also the brand, the craftsmanship, and the prestige.
Through the example and case of Petrof, which is surely just as much a matter of the heart for many of you as it is for me personally, we can see several microeconomic, macroeconomic, and actually even geoeconomic problems all at once. And it is precisely these that I want to look at today. What are we witnessing when we look at the loss of this company of ours, this piece of our Czech family silver? It is not just a piano or one company dying, so to speak. We are witnessing a rather fundamental change in the entire global mass market for acoustic pianos. We can look at the numbers from the United States. In 2024, fewer than, get this, 18,000, yes, 1,000 units of those classic pianos, grand pianos in short, what we call the acoustic piano, were sold in the United States. But mind you, nearly 190,000 digital pianos were sold, which is more than 10 digital pianos for every one classic one. That does not mean people have stopped playing the classic piano. It just means that our standard business model for pianos is falling apart. When we look at what the piano market looks like today, which is a market like any other, even if that might be an unpleasant realization for some of us, precisely because we have an emotional connection to pianos, we can see that it is long past being that one single, as we would say, homogeneous piano market. We have digital pianos here. These are gaining mass appeal because they are low cost, have small space requirements, and, with a bit of exaggeration, you can just toss them on a shelf or hide them under the bed if needed. You do not have to disturb the neighbors because you can use headphones, you save money on piano tuners, and they have many electronic features. In contrast, we have the standard classic acoustic upright piano, which is produced by companies like Petrof, and it is currently facing the greatest market pressure by far. Compared to a digital piano, it is expensive. In the moment, we will show by how much, and at the same time, it competes with all the previous pianos that were made in recent decades. It competes with second-hand pianos, and then we have the premium end. Concert acoustic pianos, grand pianos, which are of course very resistant to any changes. These are based on luxury and are used by professionals. A specific brand is associated with prestige. Unfortunately for our Petrof has settled into a segment that is sometimes called affordable luxury in certain parts of the economy. In other words, Petrof upright pianos are too good for the average middle segment, and conversely, not premium enough for the high end, which, given the market changes we will discuss today, means that suddenly the same honest handcrafted product, a Petrof upright piano, starts to become, in quotes, too cheap for those large concert halls, for those prestigious events. But at the same time, it is already very difficult to afford for a family that wants to buy a piano for their child. That is exactly what is becoming a problem for factories like our Petrof. On top of that, we are facing problems. We are facing a new shock, which this time does not come from Europe or the United States, but comes from China. For the global piano industry, and it must be said for Petrof specifically, China has been about as important in recent decades as it has been for German automakers. It represented a huge growing market. And it seemed that this traditional handcrafted product had another long era of growth ahead of it. For example, a company like Yamaha claimed that the Chinese market had climbed to 400,000 pianos per year. That is twice as many as the total of digital and acoustic pianos in the United States combined. But within a few years, it fell to just one quarter. And now, according to Yamaha, piano sales in China are dropping by about 1/3. We are seeing exactly the same thing with car manufacturers. It was a big celebration and a great success for Volkswagen, for example, when they conquered a piece of the Chinese market. But as China began supporting its own production and companies like BYD started expanding into Europe, we know, after all, that they have their own showroom and sales point in Prague. Volkswagen suddenly began to decline. Suddenly, it is losing the market that, in many moments, was effectively saving it. And you mentioned in the comments that the problem of changing relations between Prague and later the entire Czech Republic and China caused, among other things, the return of some shipments or the refusal of some Petrof piano shipments that had been agreed upon many years ago. But this is not just about a change in the Chinese people's love or lack thereof for music. We have other problems here as well. Historically, a piano was part of an investment by a typical middle class, let's say in both a good and bad sense, bourgeois family into their child. It represented building human capital, education, and social status. And then suddenly, when you have a combination of lower birth rates, a worse economic situation, a real estate crisis, and of course changes in educational policy, piano sales simply start to drop. In other words, piano sales are actually a great indicator of economic change. Just as we use gross domestic product, the unemployment rate or inflation, piano sales might actually signal in advance that something is happening in the economy, that social changes are taking place, flows between individual states, and that there are also changes in preferences within demographic shifts. And now, if you'll excuse me, come the truly brutal numbers from Chinese manufacturers. One of the world's largest piano manufacturers, Pearl River, we will talk about them later, reports a 40% year-on-year decline. Production fell by 60% in just 1 year. Even more interesting are the figures from a slightly smaller Chinese manufacturer, but we all know, and Ondra Dostal, who is in China right now, mentioned it yesterday, that size in China is incomparable to the scale of a small economy in Europe, like the Czech Republic. So, the smaller Chinese manufacturer Hailun also sold 1/3 less in 2025 than before, but their sales of digital pianos rose sharply. Yet the margin on a classic piano, as you know it, is only around 3%, while the margin on those digital pianos is nearly 25%. Does this mean that digitalization is killing an entire craft, just as we see it changing almost everything in other areas? Yamaha is quite crucial for Petrof, because Yamaha manages to be on both sides of the economic transformation at the same time. And notice, this is no longer about pianos at all. If any of you hate pianos, this is not a fairy tale about pianos. Although, as I say again, I like pianos. This is a fairy tale about a technological transition, about technological transformation and its economic impacts. This is a story about automobiles. This is a story about the labor market. This is a story, however, that we can tell particularly well through the tale of pianos and uprights. If we look at a piece of the income statement or Yamaha's data, revenue from acoustic pianos was falling precisely because of the slump in China, while revenue from digital pianos was growing thanks to the demand for digital precisely in China. So we can say that the digital piano is becoming a mass product, while acoustics, the classic piano, is more or less a premium experience. Now let's go one step further. Before the broadcast, you were asking, for example, about cigarette taxation. We all see how food prices go up or, conversely, down. We buy clothes, phones, or cars. Well, in economics, we distinguish individual goods and services based on their durability into goods with short-term consumption, medium-term, and long-term. When we buy a car, we expect long-term consumption. When we buy a roll, then probably short-term. But a piano is even compared to all durable goods, a good with, let's say, ultra long-term consumption. A piano like that, a classic piano, perhaps from Petrof, if it is sturdily made, will last not just decades, but perhaps a century. Some high-quality pianos may even mature over time. Otherwise, it is said that its lifespan in good condition is around 40 to 50 years, but with good care, a quality solid piano can last even longer. Which paradoxically means that the better pianos you produce throughout your company's long history, like the Petrof company, the more you create competition for yourself. And that is exactly what happened to Petrof. Petrof itself says today that a new acoustic piano leaving its factory in Hradec Králové is no longer just competing with Korg, Bohemia or Yamaha, but with Petrof pianos made in, say, 1995 or the year 2000. In short, the products that Petrof itself manufactured a long time ago. This creates quite an interesting paradox for us, because the higher quality and more durable the goods a company produces, the more competition it gradually creates for itself. And finally, perhaps a paradox caused by production. China, just like in the case of cars, phones, and technology in general, has long ceased to be a synonym for low-quality, second-rate goods. It is no longer true, and we see this with companies like BYD, that if something is made in China, it is, pardon the expression, economic junk. On the contrary, if we look at Pearl River products, especially their premium pianos like Kaiserberg and others, we see they are already manufacturing pieces for completely different brands. So, for example, Steinway's brand, their more affordable Essex line, is manufactured in that very factory in China. And after all, back in 2024, Petrof announced that its partner in Indonesia would begin producing their more affordable series. So Petrof itself confirms that while it will continue to produce its master pianos in Hradec Králové, it is essentially following the long-term trend of German car manufacturers by shifting production to East Asian countries. So where does Petrof really stand today? How to get to the root of his problems, and in particular how to get to the solution of his problems? Because we certainly do not want Petrof, which has overcome a whole series of wars, social unrest, many different transformations, and economic upheavals with greater or lesser problems, to not survive the year 2026 after this wave of layoffs. It is interesting here to separate the size of the company from the quality of the brand. We have a ranking of pianos here from the North American website Piano Buyer, which places Petrof in the category of exceptional pianos among very high-quality instruments. However, let us note that with the exception of those truly very, very expensive grand pianos, there are many other brands above Petrof that are comparable in price, but are simply considered to be of higher quality. And this is exactly where we see the strategic problem of these pianos of ours. It is not cheap enough to beat Asian mass production, but at the same time its main brand lacks the global pricing power, or let's say the social status, to be nearly immune to price. In short, Petrof has remained trapped in the middle. Yes, it is not for nothing that people speak of death in the middle, and Petrof is stuck right there. Which, in times when economies are thriving, when demographic growth is strong and the economy is expanding, being in the middle is actually good, because you draw market power and purchasing power from both the lower and higher economic classes. But the moment economies start to divide, when the poor get poorer and the rich get richer, suddenly that middle empties out and you become, to some extent, economically orphaned. This is not happening, and it is not a problem just for pianos. We see this with a range of consumer goods. We see it, for example, with drugstore products. We might see it with some generic medicines. We see it right now in the car market. And Petrof now has no choice but to escape this trap in the middle or try to escape in both directions. So on one hand, they must focus on top-tier instruments and try to convince world concert halls that their pianos belong there. That is quite difficult when, for example, even in the Czech Rudolfino, there is often a Steinway instead of a Petrof. They must try to focus on wealthy customers and convince them that their pianos are top tier. At the same time, they must look down. They must expand the more affordable lines they produce, for instance, in Indonesia. Then, like many other companies, they have no choice but to escape completely outside the Western world, to escape beyond Europe and beyond China. In short, looking to Mexico, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, in short, to markets that our economies viewed with a certain disdain until quite recently. That is why it is so necessary what our colleague, member of the European Parliament Australia, is doing now, traveling through these countries and trying to understand how their economy works, as he tries to establish the best possible political and economic relations there. Because by doing so, we are creating opportunities for our country so that the ties that were severed by historical pressures can be at least partially restored. Yes, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan are some of the few markets where a country of our type can still have some promise for the future. Then another escape route remaining for a traditional old-fashioned company like Petrof is to establish its own complete distribution network, not relying on our own sales representatives, but in the United States, which Petrof is doing after all, having our own representative. And finally, and this is exactly what brings us back to the beginning, there is nothing left but what is politely called streamlining production, but in practice it means laying people off. And that is something no entrepreneur ever wants to do, of course. Petrof is then nothing more than, let's say, a case study of one major economic transformation. A case study that we can all imagine because we know that piano. Some of us know that piano from our homes, some from music school, some from elementary or high school, but we all simply know what a Petrof looks like. We all know it, and in that one single piano case, we actually have in one place a picture of the entire current economic change sweeping the world. In reality, however, there is no decline in interest in pianos, just as there is no decline in interest in cars, for example. It is true that within a single generation, something has changed, especially in Czech or European families, where that classic bond has broken down. A child should play a musical instrument. Parents buy a new piano. After all, that is exactly what this industry in all of Europe grew on, especially in the 60s or 80s. The problem is not that Petrof has become unaffordable for the middle class. After all, in the 60s, a Petrof cost roughly the same multiple of the average wage of a Czech or Czechoslovak employee as it does today. In terms of purchasing power, these pianos have neither become significantly more expensive nor significantly cheaper. The problem is that so-called substitutes or alternatives to this piano have become incredibly cheap. In the 60s, a parent's decision lay between two extremes, an expensive piano or no piano at all. Today, the choice is between spending $250,000 on a new piano or 10 to 20,000 on a quality digital instrument. It is not a lot of money versus zero. It is a lot of money versus a quite reasonable amount versus zero. And of course, we already said that the digital piano has many advantages, which for today's urban lifestyle are quite appealing. So we are dealing with a classic microeconomic situation. The absolute accessibility of the piano has not worsened at all. We cannot say that people cannot afford it, but the price of its closest alternatives, its closest substitutes, has dropped dramatically. Moreover, data from the United States or Britain shows that children have not stopped making music in the slightest. And after all, the Czech Republic still maintains that network of folk art schools, although now under the name Basic Art School, which was founded sometime in the 60s of the last century and which was based on the idea that playing a musical instrument should be accessible to the widest possible part of society. Let's jump back to China for a moment. They are actually discussing this quite a bit in Chinese economic journals. It is said that before COVID, around 40 million children in China were playing the piano in schools. But within a few years, that number dropped to approximately 1/4. Reuters showed that for one Beijing teacher, the number of piano students dropped from 70 to 30. And why is this so incredibly important for the Czech company Petrof? Because about 300,000 pianos were disappearing into China. That drop of 300,000 pianos in Chinese demand is no small piece for Petrof. It is a major loss of its economic revenue without even addressing any changes between Chinese and Czech economic ties. We have also already discussed that the problem for Petrof is that it almost never ages. But another issue we should consider is what a person can buy today for the value of one piano. 50 or 100 years ago, a family would not buy an 88-key piano with 3 pedals for a few months' salary. They were also buying an educational tool for their children, a home medium for musical production, a certain symbol of cultural status, a representative piece of furniture, simply a nice thing to have in the living room, a certain family activity or family togetherness, and of course, a long-term asset. After all, many of you surely know those stories about how parents bought a Czech piano and then sold it before the wedding to pay for the wedding or to have money for a fresh start. So what was the person actually buying back then for those 6 salaries? 50 or 100 years ago, a piano was, in today's modern terms, a platform of sorts. It was not just a musical instrument, but actually an institution. Historians would call it an institution that maintained the bourgeois household as the center of social life. Let us recall, for example, Neff's Marriage of Reason, where they talk about those salons where young Antonin Dvořák used to go to play the piano, the lady of the house's piano. So the piano became both physically and artistically a kind of center, not just of the living room, but of the entire life of those wealthier middle-class families. At the same time, it was one thing that visitors immediately saw, and by which the family signaled their difference from, let's say, the working class and their own bourgeois status. And at the same time, if anyone in 1900 or long after wanted to have music at home, they simply had to have someone who could play, or at least sing. The piano was both a player and a performer at the same time. Of course, the arrival of the radio, the gramophone, and the phonograph began to undermine this function of the piano. After all, professional literature explicitly speaks of the decline of the piano precisely during the rise of gramophones or radios. But still, the piano was for a long time one of the technologies of, let's say, home entertainment. Yes, Netflix, HBO, YouTube, and not even those, to be clear, existed. So 50 or 100 years ago, the piano undoubtedly had many more functions than it does today. But even more important in the Czech lands is the relationship with the child. In our country, since 1961, basic music schools were transformed into these lidušky, and the state planned a network of schools so that there was at least one in every district. The mission was to educate amateurs and also develop aesthetic education, which, by the way, paid off quite well in our country. After all, from that time we have great generations of famous pianists, performers, and conductors. At the same time, the service was provided extremely cheaply. A lesson could not cost more than 40 Czechoslovak korunas per month, even in the 80s. So the state provided cheap teacher labor. The family provided the child with what we might call capital, that is the piano, which could be passed down in the family from child to child and perhaps from generation to generation. And so we can say that it was a one-time investment in a certain status and human capital for a long time. On the other hand, this completely collapsed because, after all, music in the Czech lands and in Czech education still maintains a fairly solid level. Maybe we don't have such a big problem with that yet. But we are perhaps seeing an even deeper change in the perception of the piano from a social perspective as something that can economically elevate a family to a higher level. It seems that knowing how to play the piano is no longer cultural capital, that it no longer increases a young girl's chances of a good marriage, that it no longer increases the business opportunities the master of the house might gain by meeting his partners in a parlor where his wife is playing. And once part of that status significance of the product is lost, a person is no longer willing to pay as much for the instrument, for the same instruments. So, to sum up the whole story of the economics of a classic piano, if a piano used to be a musical instrument, a tool for education, a means of home entertainment, a generator of social status, social standing, a beautiful piece of furniture, something that brought the family together for shared activities, and also a long-term asset that could always be sold for a decent price. Today, education is taken care of by things like YouTube. After all, there are quite a lot of various demonstrations of how to play an instrument there. As for home music, that is taken care of by the Spotify app on your mobile or, again, YouTube on your computer. Status is built these days more on social media or with a new mobile, a new iPhone, than by playing the piano. You can buy an acoustic instrument, either used or just a digital version, and that $250,000, it has much more competition today. That $250,000, many more products, services, options, travel and vacations are fighting for that $250,000. Things like digital gadgets and the like, much more than before. So what remains for Petrof in the year 2026 is essentially, let's say, aesthetics, craftsmanship, and perhaps ingenuity, how to succeed in this new era and how, despite all other crises and all other changes, to keep this brand, which has been on our market for over 160 years, alive. I honestly wish for the Petrofs to succeed. The brand deserves it. The Petrof family deserves it. having accompanied Czech music and art for many decades. But at the same time, we all somehow sense that it will not be easy at all. Before we move on to the next part of today's free market, I will, if I may, take a look at who among you guessed which piece we were just listening to on the keys and strings of the Petrof at the start of today's broadcast.